to the presentation. Today's presentation is being recorded. This session will only have the capacity for 100 people, so if anyone was not able to get in before that filled up, which happened about 5 minutes ago, we will send them the recording in litmus tomorrow, and they'll have a week to watch this. So no worries about that. Everyone's mics will be muted today for the presentation. Our materials are downloadable from the materials pod below. And for those sharing screens, I know in the past that we've just had you all type out your names into the chat, but today we would prefer if you would actually just email us at HMIS@thn.org. All right. I'm going to hop over to our presentation. So, welcome to the HMIS Data Security, Ethics, and Privacy webinar. So thanks for joining us. All balance of state HMIS users are required to complete this training annually to maintain their HMIS license. This is required by HUD. Texas Homeless Network takes this training very seriously, as we want all of our users, as well as any staff members, to understand their responsibilities. This training is based on privacy and security standards set forth by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which we'll call HUD from here on out. And again, as I already said, if you are sharing screens with a coworker, please email us. And also, I want everyone to, if you're able to, look at the list of attendees. If you don't see your name in that list, that means that we don't necessarily know that you're here. So you'll need to email us your name. All right, let's get started. So looking at our agenda for today, this training is going to be broken up into 4 distinct parts. First, we'll take a look at some data security basics, including passwords. We will then dive into the HMIS user responsibilities. And Antonio is going to walk us through client information security, including best practices regarding user activity and data files on your computer, and what to do in situations where you might be looking at a phishing email. Next up, Marissa will take a look at confidentiality and privacy standards as they've been outlined by HUD, as well as collection limitations. And then Victoria is going to walk us through the Texas Balance of States Release of Information document, which we will refer to as the ROI. She will also discuss how the ROI works within HMIS. Depending on how the client answers the ROI, you may need to change certain settings in the client record. And finally, Antonio is going to talk to us about HMIS ethics. So what does an ethical HMIS user look like, and how can you best report unethical behavior? Assuming we don't have any major technical issues today, knocking on wood, we can hopefully get everyone out of here a few minutes early today. So let's start with some data security basics. So each of us collects, manages, and transfers sensitive data every day, whether we realize it or not. When you collect personal information from a client, or create a new password for your account on a website, or when you email a coworker a spreadsheet with data, these are all moments that make us vulnerable to a data breach. So today I want to highlight some reasons that data security is important, and then also walk through some of those small steps that we can take to make sure that we keep our data secure. And moving along. So let's talk about why data security is important. I want you to imagine a scenario where you drive your car to the grocery, and once you're inside the store shopping, you suddenly remember that you forgot to lock your car, and in fact, the driver's door is wide open and the keys are in the ignition. You would panic and run outside, right? That's the attitude that we should have regarding the protection of our digital valuables as well as our physical ones. So we should be concerned with protecting our clients' sensitive data, maintaining our agency's reputation, which might play into maintaining our agency's funding. And not only is data security good practice from a business perspective, but it's also often a legal requirement. Next slide, we have, we have the 6 most common reasons for HIPAA data violations and fines. So while many of our HMIS users are not responsible for HIPAA compliance, These examples do a great job of showing how most of these data breaches are happening on the employee level. So we have stolen laptop or smartphone or a USB device, malware incident, ransomware attack or hacking incident, an office break-in, or sending data to the wrong patient or contact, as well as social media posts. So the truth is that over half of all data breaches at small and medium-sized companies are caused by negligent employees. We know that employees are our company's greatest assets, but they're also its greatest security risk. So with that in mind, we all need to be more cognizant and think about security as a mindset. So let's think twice. We should beware of phishing scams, which we're going to talk about a little more later on in the presentation. We should avoid opening unusual email attachments. So make sure that you know the sender before you open any types of links or attachments. And when in doubt, you can always contact the sender to verify that they actually sent you the email. You should work on unsecured networks with caution. So if you're working remotely, as a lot of us are these days, if you're on public Wi-Fi, like at a coffee shop, you should be really cognizant of what information you're sharing over that network. And you should ensure that no longer used data is completely removed and cannot be recovered by unauthorized people. And it's best to back up regularly on a different device, such as an external hard drive or the cloud, in case of a really bad day, like the person in this photo is having. All right. So let's make a strong and safe password together. A strong password should be 8 to 10 characters long. It should include a capital and lowercase letter, a number, and a special character. You should always keep your password to yourself. Try not to use common or simple words like birthdays or pet names. And as tempting as it may be, do not use the same password for multiple accounts. I know we're all guilty of doing that, but we should not be doing that. And don't leave your password written down in a place that is easily accessed. So here's a formula that I like to use to help make an easy yet incredibly strong password. So you take a sentence that you can easily remember. Perhaps it relates to the website that you're making the password for. So in this example, the sentence is, I buy 2 mangoes at the market every week. You take the first letter of each word, which in this example, we will capitalize the letter I, and and then include the number 2 instead of the word 2. And I would actually strengthen this even further by adding an exclamation point at the end, so we get that special character. And at this point, you have an incredibly strong password. Obviously, no one should use this specific example for their password. Okay, moving along. Speaking of passwords, let's talk about the specific criteria you need to hit for your client track password. Your password will require a minimum of 8 characters, though best practice is actually 10 characters, with a minimum of 1 number, capital letter, and symbol. When changing passwords, you can't use any of the last 6 that you've used, and passwords expire every year. The HMIS Help Desk does not know your password, and we cannot give you your old password if you forget it or lose it. For added security, the password is not allowed to be retrieved, so you can reset your password if you set up your recovery information, which we highly suggest that everyone do. And lastly, as a security precaution, never save your passwords to your computer. Okay. Thanks for bearing with me. So as an HMIS user, these are some baseline requirements that we expect from you. Do not access HMIS client data on a public computer, like say at the library. Do not access HMIS client data on a public setting, like say on a coffee shop's Wi-Fi. Do not access client data over an unsecured public Wi-Fi, like even free city Wi-Fi, for example. And do not access HMIS on computers that do not have locking screens. So next up, let's talk about our HMIS user responsibilities. Your responsibilities are to take appropriate measures to prevent unauthorized data disclosures, report any security violations such as sharing passwords, comply with relevant policies and procedures, notify HMIS staff once an employee is no longer employed. That way we can deactivate that user's account and keep our client's data secure. And also attend HMIS webinars as you're doing today. on a regular basis for current or upcoming information. So moving into HMIS user activity, I want to talk about the HMIS user agreement. That's the agreement that every HMIS user signs before they receive their HMIS login information. Users not participating in HMIS for more than 45 days will be locked out due to non-activity, and at that point you will have to retrain to regain access to the system. Inactive accounts will be automatically deactivated to help prevent unauthorized access. We find this deactivation policy important for a number of reasons, including the fact that any active account can be an exploit, and limiting the number of active accounts helps mitigate the risk of a data breach. And also billing. So by deactivating those unused accounts, we are attempting to save our agencies from having to pay for licenses that they aren't necessarily using. So you could be replacing an unused license instead of paying for a brand new one. Now let's chat about sharing user IDs. The HMIS agreement states that my user ID and password are for my use only and must not be shared with anyone, including my local HMIS administrator and executives. And the importance of that is accountability and clarity. It wouldn't be fair to the clients that we serve if we're not taking their privacy seriously and respecting that each user who logs into HMIS has taken the appropriate training and understands the responsibilities of having that HMIS login. And so in practice, sharing user IDs or logins is strictly prohibited. So you'll see that I have a screenshot here of the digital THN HMIS user agreement. The user agreement has been updated over the last year, which means that if your agency is still holding on to that old physical paper copy of the user agreement, you can go ahead and discard that because that copy is no longer relevant. We've added some things and we've taken other things out to reflect the most updated and relevant information. So moving forward, any new users will need to sign the Google form, digital copy, which we will show you where that's at in just a little bit. And speaking of which, I wanted to quickly walk through the very last part of the HMIS user agreement, the signatures section. Since many of us are working remotely these days due to the pandemic, there is a workaround to collecting these digital signatures. So obviously you will sign or type your own name into the HMIS user agreement box. But if you are not in the same physical space as your direct supervisor or your HMIS administrator, you can get verbal consent from these individuals and then just type their name into the box for them. So long as they know that you're doing that, that's totally fine. Also, because so much has changed on the HMIS user agreement in the last year, we have instituted a new policy which requires that all HMIS users need to re-sign the HMIS user agreement annually, once a year, so that we can make sure that everyone is up to date on all of these changes and updates. So this is going to happen every year after the data security webinar, which is what we're doing today. So after today's webinar, I'm going to send out an email to every HMIS user with a link to the HMIS user agreement, which everyone will need to read through and submit, just acknowledging that you're agreeing to all of the new updated HMIS policies. Okay, so that's it for basic data security. I'm now going to pass things over to Antonio, who is going to walk us through computer security.
Thank you, Lindsay. I'm just going to pause for a moment and check my volume, make sure everyone can hear me. Do I sound all right? Testing. Okay. Sounds good. Okay, so I'm going to be covering TA request and submitting a ticket. So there are 3 ways of sending in a ticket to HMIS Help Desk. The first way and the preferred method is the client track TA ticket. So that's sending a client track ticket through HMIS. The biggest advantage of sending a ticket through client track is that it's secured. You can also send screenshots of HMIS through client track. So if you have any sort of question that you have a screenshot attached to, please send them through client track instead of email, because email, unfortunately, is not as secure as we want it to be. So email, again, is not as secure, and you should also never be sending any socials, date of birth, any sort of PII, personal identifying information. You shouldn't be sending any of that through email. The third method here of getting in contact with us is through a phone. You can leave a voicemail. Please leave your name, organization, and a description of your issue. That really helps us whenever we get on the phone with you to be prepared. Okay. Computer security. Next up, we're going to talk about security at your workplace. A lot of this is common sense, but it's good to go over. So all computers must have a username, password, firewall, and an up-to-date antivirus software. Hopefully you have some sort of IT person that's taking care of the firewall and antivirus. You also want to secure your work area before leaving it unattended. Client track does time out after 30 minutes, but a lot can happen in 30 minutes. So go ahead and log out whenever you walk away. We also are trying to prevent other coworkers from accidentally logging into your account or seeing that your account is open and thinking it's theirs and then entering the client's information. So, a lot of the times the data errors are caused not by malicious intent, but more by just accidents. So you want to make sure to shut down, log off, and put your computer and other devices to sleep before leaving them unattended. And there is a feature also where you just sign into your computer once and then it stays logged in. If you have that, it's very convenient, but in terms of security, it's probably not the best. So I know it's inconvenient, but it's good to have that that secure password whenever your computer wakes up from sleep. Okay, and now I'm going to cover physical data. So like papers, anything you might have printed out of HMIS, or maybe some sort of client files that are related to the client in HMIS. So with any sensitive information, you don't want to leave it lying around. Printers, I think, are a very notorious area for having tons of paper just thrown around, just because you might accidentally copy 2 or 3 versions of it and you leave one to the side or something. We just want to make sure to shred those or get rid of them the best you can. Also, same goes for any sort of file cabinets. If you're storing a bunch of client files in there, it's good to have it under lock whenever you leave at the end of the day. And also, if you have any portable equipment, that's another good thing to keep locked up. All right, so I'm going to go into phishing in email correspondence. So I think by now everyone has probably seen an example of a phishing email. They are getting harder to spot, so I think that's why it's really important for us to bring up again the importance of always being vigilant, always checking each email and making sure that the email address is from the right one, right? A lot of times they'll make an email address that's really similar to your work ones, but instead of a .org, it'll be a .com. So unfortunately, they are getting pretty sneaky like that. So here is the definition of phishing: fraudulent practice of sending emails purporting to be from reputable companies in order to induce individuals to reveal personal information such as passwords and credit card numbers. So our way of kind of keeping vigilant, aside from what your IT people can do on their end, is just always check the credentials, verify that the correspondence is from a trusted address, because a lot of times the phishing attempts really do look like legitimate emails. They'll even go as far as maybe using Photoshop to copy your letterhead and things like that. If you do receive any emails that are kind of suspicious coming from THN, so whenever I say suspicious, you know what sort of information THN would provide in an email. We would never request for PII. We would never request socials or bank account numbers or anything like that. Here are a couple of bullet points about THN emails. So the correspondence will be in English. The correspondence will end in thn.org. And again, just to reiterate, we'll never request socials, date of birth. Through email, we really only try to refer to the client by their client ID. Any PII information should be discussed through client track tickets because that's a managed, secure way of communicating. Okay. Now comes the files on server and downloads folder. So the files on server, if you run exports or reports in HMIS, you might be familiar with it. It's a place that stores pretty much all the reports that you've ran. And the downloads folder is, the downloads folder on your computer. A lot of times, those folders can grow if you don't periodically delete the files. So we just want to make everyone aware that it's good practice to regularly go into your downloads folder and delete those files, and the same with your files on server. The downloads folder, I think a lot of you must know, it can be a treasure trove of data for people that are looking are trying to hack or trying to take your data for some reason. Okay, so in review, stay active, stay vigilant, and stay supported. So stay active, log in within 45 days to stay active. Do get locked out for inactivity. You want to stay vigilant. Think critically about all emails that come through, especially if they're asking for sensitive information. We also want to limit the number of files that we're storing on our computer and on the server. And then stay supported. If you have any questions, go ahead and send them through a client track ticket or an email at hmis@thn.org. So I'm going to go ahead and pass things over to Marissa.
Hello, thanks Antonio. Now we're going to move on to data security and privacy as they are outlined in the 2004 HMIS data standards. We will cover pertinent sections from this document and identify some best practices. You'll hear privacy policy and privacy consumer notice thrown around quite a bit in the next few minutes. And please note that these are not interchangeable and are in fact two separate documents that your agency should have. The privacy consumer notice alerts clients that their data is being collected, and the privacy policy goes more in depth into the purpose of data collection, what types of data are collected, and what instances data are disclosed. Let's start with privacy and confidentiality. Privacy is the control over the extent, timing, and circumstances of sharing oneself with others. It is about people, a sense of being in control of access that others have to ourselves. A right to be protected is in the eye of the participant, not the program, the COC, HMIS staff, or a researcher. Confidentiality pertains to the treatment of a client's information that they have disclosed in a relationship of trust and with the expectation that it will not be divulged to others without their permission in ways that are inconsistent with their understanding of the original intent of the purposes their information was collected and recorded for. Confidentiality is about identifiable data, is an extension of privacy, is an agreement about data maintenance and who has access to identifiable data, and in regards to HIPAA, protects patients from inappropriate disclosures of protected health information, or PHI. Security is a means of ensuring that data is kept safe from corruption and that access to it is suitably controlled. In other words, it helps to ensure privacy and confidentiality. The technical part of the 2004 standards splits privacy and security into two tiers: things that you are required to do and things that you can do if you so choose. Privacy and security applies to all agencies and programs entering data into HMIS regardless of your funding source. This includes the continuum of care, homeless service providers, HMIS staff, and HMIS software hosting staff, and any employees, volunteers, and associates who have access to the HMIS system or HMIS client information. This also means that any homeless service provider who does not receive HUD funding, such as faith-based organizations or a city or state agency that is accessing the system, must also adhere to the privacy and security requirements. These privacy standards were developed in consultation with the national privacy experts and were developed based on fair information practices, and many principles and practices were borrowed from the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA as it is better known, the nation's standard in dealing with the protection of health information. These privacy policies are meant to ensure that programs have control around the collection, management, storage, and usage of their clients' personal protected information, or PPI. PPI refers to data like name, social security, addresses, and more. The HMIS privacy standards protect client personal information from unauthorized disclosure. There are 6 components: collection limitations, purpose and use limitations, openness, access and correction, accountability, and data quality. Though the following information is more at a higher organizational level, we are going to review each of these components in detail so that you as an individual HMIS user have an understanding of each one. As we go through these, please think of your own agency's protocols regarding data privacy. There are some collection limitations that need to be adhered to. Organizations can't collect and use information just because. Collect data that makes sense for the program you run and in accordance with the requirements from your funding source. In other words, don't collect shoe size unless you're providing shoes to clients as part of your program and you need the information to order more. Organizations should also make sure to use lawful and fair means to collect data. Make sure the client has some knowledge that you are collecting it and indicating who or where that data is coming from if it is not coming from the client directly. For HMIS purposes, all programs must post a sign at the intake desk or area that explains in general terms the reason you are collecting information from the client, and agencies must have privacy policies in place. We call this document the consumer notice, though it can be called the privacy notice. Purpose and use limitations stem back to collection limitations. This is about having a privacy policy that describes clearly for the client how their data is going to be used and who will have access to it. This is not about restricting use or access, it's about being transparent. There are things that your organization has to do in order to maintain that transparency. Consumer or privacy notices must specify why you are collecting the data and describe how you are going to use it. A program may only use or disclose personal client information if it is allowed by the HMIS standards and as long as it is described in the agency's and HMIS privacy notice. The notice, because it describes why and how the client's information can be used, may infer consent for those uses, eliminating the need for written consent to put client data into HMIS. However, if your organization intends to use the data for purposes not stated in the notice, then you need either a written consent from the client or proof that its use is a legal requirement. In other words, with the proper privacy notice, your agency does not need written permission to collect HMIS data. However, you do need written consent in order to share that information in HMIS. You can find the privacy notice on our website by going to thn.org, hovering over the Texas Balance of State COC, going to our Homeless Management Information System, and then clicking HMIS Start Kit. and then selecting the HMIS privacy notice, and we have both versions on our website, English and Spanish. This is a list of allowable uses and disclosures from the 2004 standards. Not all of these things specifically need to be on the privacy notice. A full list of uses and disclosures can be inserted into the privacy policy, so long as the policy is made easily available to the client. Some uses include to provide and coordinate services, payment or reimbursement, administrative functions, create de-identified PPI, avert serious threat to health and safety, academic research, or law enforcement. Openness is about transparency. Again, privacy notices and policies must be made available to anyone who requests them, including clients and media. If your organization has a website, both the organization's privacy policy and privacy consumer notice must be made available on your website. Other suggested things you can do to be transparent are provide a simplified copy of your privacy notice as a handout to your clients during intake. Be aware that if your agency serves clients whose primary language is not English, you will need to translate the notice handout into that language. Second, you can provide advance notice of when you are going to change your privacy policies. Your organization must also provide an opportunity and process to allow clients to review and make revisions to their information. You must offer to explain what data is protected and consider requests to correct anything that the client perceives as inaccurate or incomplete. In some cases, you may actually deny access to some information. For instance, if you know the Social Security number is correct because it was verified by an agency of authority, but you must explain why you will not provide access or correction to this data. Other suggested things you could do to give fair access are allow appeal of denial of access or correction, limit grounds for denial of access, allow a statement of disagreement, or provide a written explanation for denial. Accountability means taking responsibility for enforcing your privacy policies and having a process in place for someone to make sure that you stand by your policies. In addition to your organization's privacy policies and procedures, you must develop and put in place a confidentiality agreement with all staff members collecting, entering, and accessing client data. This is most commonly included as part of the end-user agreement, but make sure that the end-user agreement includes language that specifically states that by signing this agreement, the staff person is acknowledging receipt of and pledging compliance with the privacy notice. Another alternative is to make this a separate form that staff sign and tie it to an annual training. Other things that you can consider are regularly auditing for privacy compliance and setting up a process for privacy complaints and access and correction appeals, designating a single person, preferably a person with authority in your agency, to be a chief privacy officer, which is someone who manages the privacy policies and procedures, accepts and reviews access and correction requests, determines access and correction approval or denial, and manages the auditing and appeal processes. The Texas Homeless Network has its own version of a privacy policy and consumer notice. Your organization also needs to have its own version of these documents, so it can use THN's documents as a guide. Again, they can be found on THN's website. Now I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Antonio to talk to you about data quality and timeliness.
Thank you, Marissa. All right, so many of you are probably familiar with our quarterly UDQ process or our data quality checks. And the purpose of these quarterly checks is to ensure that our data is relevant, accurate, complete, and timely. To assist you in assessing and managing your data quality process at an organizational level, there is a resource on the HUD Exchange called the HMIS Data Quality Toolkit. This resource is really useful for agencies that haven't quite solidified their UDQ process. It could be new agencies or even agencies that have been around for a while but just want to come back and touch up the UDQ process. You can find that toolkit on the HUD exchange. And another tool that I think is really useful is the data quality report in HMIS, so the UDQ report. I suggest that everyone run one of those reports just to be familiar with the different elements that are in the data quality report. It's also worth mentioning that the Notice of Funding Availability, or the NOFA, specifically asks about data quality within the COC, and it's part of the scoring process. So your organization must have a plan for disposing of personal protected information for data that's no longer in use. So that means if PPI, or personal information, hasn't been used for over over 7 years, then it should be deleted, unless there are other, regulations, or if it's specifically mandated for your organization or for your grant, then you can keep it for longer, but it's recommended to delete it after 7 years. So this data quality plan is probably the bare minimum for an organization. If capacity allows it, there's other things that you can do to kind of make sure that data quality is good in your organization, and that includes training, and also testing new employees' data. So when I say testing, I really mean like auditing, running data quality reports. So let me go into the next slide now about timeliness, which ties into data quality. So timeliness is very important whenever you're striving for accurate data. Data entered in a timely manner reduces human error that occurs when too much time has elapsed between data collection and data entry. So it's easy to forget exit dates, services, and referrals after a few days, especially if you're working in a hectic environment like a lot of you are. So the sooner the data that is entered, the better chance the data will have of being correct. So timely data entry also ensures that the data is accessible when it's needed for monitoring, for meeting funder requirements, and for the vast number of reports that we have to submit every once in a while. A lot of times that causes issues if the back data entry is over a month or two. That means that the majority of the reports that were submitted, for that month or two were inaccurate. So ideally, we will complete all data entry in HMIS at the time of service. So that is direct data entry. This helps to cut down on paper use as well as human error. However, there are occasional circumstances that prevent us from doing direct data entry. So if for some reason entering data directly into HMIS isn't possible, it's really important that if you are doing paper surveys, to make sure that you have all the questions from the HMIS workflow. A lot of the times, people will find intake forms and they'll think it's generic enough to work for HMIS, but then whenever they go in to do the back data entry, they'll realize that they don't quite match up and they have a lot of missing data. So emergency shelters, homelessness prevention, and rapid rehousing projects must enter all information within 1 business day. Coordinated entry, transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, outreach, and supportive services only programs must enter all intake assessment information within 3 business days or 24 business hours. If we wait longer to enter data, we run the risk of the client being gone, so we can't ask potential follow-up questions. So now I'm going to go ahead and pass things off to Victoria. And she's going to cover a little bit about ROI.
Thanks, Antonio. So I'd like to spend a little time first talking about the release of information and privacy notice. But before I go any further, I just want to check my sound and make sure that I am clear and everybody can hear me. All right, it looks like people are saying that we are good to go. So at this point, let's talk about the release of information, which I will refer to as the ROI from here on out, and also the HMIS privacy notice. I'm going to give some contextual information on these documents. I'll show you where to find them on our website, and also briefly review the individual sections of the paper ROI. We'll also briefly look at the privacy notice. And lastly, we'll take a look at how sections of the paper ROI translate into actions that you should be taking in HMIS. All right, the opportunities of the ROI. Each adult in the household aged 18 and over needs to sign their own ROI. I'd like you to think of the ROI as an opportunity to provide client information about privacy, confidentiality, and security, so they are providing informed consent. It's also an opportunity to empower the client to make a decision regarding how they would like their information shared in HMIS, or even if they want to share it. First, to be clear, as a best practice, the ROI needs to be completed with the client prior to any instance in which you collect data. So our expectation is that without the ROI on file, you should not even begin the intake paperwork for the client. Because although the ROI controls how the client's data is shared, it also outlines situations in which a client's data may be disclosed regardless of whether or not the client decides to share their data. And that's why it's important to review the ROI with the client beforehand to ensure that they understand the implications. So I'd like you to consider it step 0. The time dedicated to thoroughly reviewing the ROI with the client should be used to answer any lingering questions that the client may have about their rights and how their data may be used. There are 2 ways that we can collect consent from our clients for the ROI. The first is the most desirable way to gain consent, and that's written consent. If the client is able to, have them physically sign a paper copy of the ROI for your files, reviewing all of the information with them. If you're not able to get written consent from your client, meaning they are not able to physically present at your office or agency to physically sign the ROI, you can have this conversation over the phone or verbally with your client. Now, this is not as desirable as getting written consent from the client, but there will be situations in which written consent is not possible, and that's totally okay. The COVID-19 pandemic is a great example, great example of this situation. Maybe not great. But because of the pandemic, we might have to pivot from our normal consent collection process because we might not be able to get that written consent as often as we used to. So I'd like to spend a little time discussing the verbal consent process and what that looks like. One thing to note, if you cannot gain written consent for whatever reason at the time of intake, you can collect verbal consent. If the client is able to eventually sign the ROI further down the road, we should still seek to gain that written consent once you're able to. So verbal consent is not like the end-all be-all. If you're able to get written consent later on, our expectation is that you will do so with the client. So these are the appropriate measures that you need to follow to collect verbal consent from your clients. We must get verbal consent from each individual 18 and older. We must give each client context about what the ROI is and what we're collecting it for. Then we must read the entire ROI to our client. We need to make sure that they understand what it is that they're consenting to. And I know that that sounds like a lot, but when I go through the demonstration of the paper ROI, we're going to see that it's really just one page of text. And I'm going to read you the ROI word for word as if you were a client or a participant in our program. And we're going to see just how quickly it goes when we read it word for word. We must also ensure that we answer any question on the ROI and that the client answers any questions on the ROI. And we're going to take a look at what those specific questions are in just a moment when we do our demo. You should also read our privacy notice word for word. And again, we're going to dive into the privacy notice here in a little bit as well. We should ask each client if they have access to an email account. And if so, we should offer to email them a copy of the ROI, our privacy notice, and our privacy policy for their records. And Marissa mentioned that, privacy notice and privacy policy are interchangeable. We're really just going to focus on the privacy notice for the demonstration because I do not have any expectation that you're going to actually read out the entire privacy policy. That is a much longer document, and that is not our expectation that you would read that word for word with them. And also, before moving on, we need to ensure that the client does not have any questions left over about the ROI. Again, it's important that the client knows what their rights are and what's happening with the data that we're collecting from them. All right, with that being said, let's take a look at these documents. So if you will give me 1 second, I'm going to switch over and share my screen. All right, at any point, please let me know if, for whatever reason, my screen share goes out. But we're going to start on the thn.org website. And Marissa kind of outlined the steps of where you would go. So once you are on the THN website, you'll hover over Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care. You'll then scroll down and hover over Homeless Management Information System and click on HMIS Start Kit. I want to point out very briefly that the HMIS user agreement is also on this Start Kit page. So you'll click on the user agreement link, and it'll take you directly to the digital user agreement form. We also have copies of the release of information in English and Spanish and the HMIS privacy notice in English and Spanish. And our privacy policy is located here as well. And this is what I mean by it is too long for you to read word for word with the client. It's 16 pages long, but this should be something that you email to the client if they have an email address available. All right, let's hop into the release of information. So this is the paper version of the ROI. It's 3 pages long, but again, you'll see that the text is really just focused on the first page. And the second and third pages are where we actually get client signatures and staff signatures. So just to demonstrate how quickly it can go to review the ROI with the client, I'm going to read this word for word. And I know this is probably going to seem banal, but I do want, especially for newer users, to have this experience of what it's like to kind of read this word for word. So this is the Texas Balance of State Homeless Management Information System Release of Information. This first section about HMIS just gives contextual information about our system. The Homeless Management Information System, HMIS, or Client Track, is a secure online database used by this agency to store personal information from people who receive help. By agreeing to receive help from us, you are allowing us to collect and enter your information into HMIS. Personal information collected and entered into HMIS includes, but is not limited, to name, social security number, date of birth, gender, race, ethnicity, housing status, income and sources, referrals, referral outcomes, and photographs. About this form. This form controls whether or not you share your information in HMIS. Sharing means that HMIS users at other agencies using HMIS can see your information. And to be clear, when we say using HMIS, what we mean is using the Texas Balance of State HMIS system. HMIS has security rules that are updated regularly to meet privacy and confidentiality laws. All HMIS users are required to sign a confidentiality agreement agreeing to protect your privacy. And a list of agencies using our HMIS can be found here. This list will change as agencies stop or start using HMIS. By signing this form, you are allowing the sharing of your information with other agencies using HMIS for 7 years or until stopped by you. Sharing may reduce the time you have to spend answering questions. Sharing may make it easier for us to match help to your household. Sharing may also make reporting to funders easier, which may bring more funding to our community to help end homelessness. These are your rights: to not share your personal information, to receive help regardless of your decision about sharing your information, to get a copy of the Texas Balanced Estate Continuum of Care HMIS privacy policy, to get a copy of your personal information in HMIS, and just to, as a side here, if you need help from us, or if you as a user are not sure how to get this information, please reach out to HMIS@thn.org and we can help you with requests like this. Your next right is to ask us or any agency using HMIS to correct mistakes related to your personal information in the system, to submit a question regarding HMIS, request to cancel the sharing you allowed, or file a grievance with our HMIS administrator. You also have the right to submit an appeal to THN at hmis@thn.org. Here are the instances where your information may be shared outside of HMIS. Your information may be used and released outside of the system for the following reasons, whether or not you opt to share your information. These situations would be to provide or match your household to help, which includes through case conferencing or using our housing priority list. To carry out administrative purposes, such as legal, financial, audit, personnel, oversight, and management. For creating de-identified information, as required by law, to prevent a serious threat to health and safety, to report abuse, neglect, or domestic violence, for research purposes, or for law enforcement purposes, such as in response to a lawful and specific court order subpoena. And that is it. That is the ROI in full. So as I hopefully demonstrated, it may sound lame when we ask you to go over the ROI word for word with clients, but it should not take very long. It is not a long process. The second and third pages are where you collect the consent from the client. So if the client agrees to share their information in HMIS, they agree to share their information with other agencies in HMIS, you would get their participant signature in this first line, in the first box, and get them to print their name and the dates, and then you as project staff would fill out the second line. Now, this second box for minor children information, we sometimes get questions on this box. It is slightly different than the first box. This first box is getting participant written consent that they want to share their information. This box, however, indicates that the client does not want to share their children's information, and children being age 17 and younger. So the first box is saying, yes, please share my information, 18 and older. And this second box is saying, by signing here, I am indicating that the children indicated here should not have their information shared. So it's a little bit of a switcheroo, but I'll demonstrate what this looks like in HMIS. So if the client comes to you and they say, you know, I'm okay with my info being shared, but not my children's, list out the children's names, and then have the client or participant or guardian sign in this line, and then project staff signs in the second line. For verbal consent, you will want to switch to the third page of the ROI. If the client, if the participant consents to share their information with other agencies in HMIS, you will indicate yes. If they tell you over the phone or verbally, no, I do not want my information shared, then you would check this no box. If the client consents to share their children's information with other agencies in HMIS, that is a checkbox, or excuse me, a check in this box for yes. If the client says, no, I do not want to share my children's information, then obviously you would check the box for no. If verbal consent is granted by the participant, if they say, yes, I do want to share my information, and you get that check in this box here, you as the project staff are going to sign on behalf of the client in this line. And we have this note here that the ROI must be reviewed again and signed, a signed copy obtained when the household physically presents for services. And you know, to be completely honest with y'all, you will probably have situations in which the client never physically presents at your agency again, or at all, if they you know, started with a verbal consent procedure and then never showed up at your agency. This might not be possible. We're just asking that all agencies do their due diligence, and if we have a situation where a client verbally consents 1 month and then the following month they actually physically present at your agency, please go through the paper ROI with them again and get a written signature from them. All right, before we jump into HMIS, let's take a look at the privacy policy. It is just a single page, and you know, this isn't something that I will go through with you word for word, although I would like you to go through this with clients word for word. But it just lists out the situations in which the data will be used with or without prior consent. So it just makes this section of the ROI more prominent in the privacy notice, and also gives information about why we collect information, right? It's important to run programs to improve services for clients and others, and to better understand participant needs. And also gives information about you know, what we consider appropriate or required data to collect. And of course, you know, they have the right to decline to share their information, though it may take longer to organize referrals. So this privacy notice is really just like a condensation of the ROI. All right, I am going to switch to HMIS so we can kind of go through a short demonstration of how the ROI lines up with what you should be seeing in the system, and kind of let me make my screen a little bigger. So we'll start an intake for a client, and this is just a test client that I have here. I'm going to use the current client. So on the basic client information page, when you start an intake, you'll notice at the very bottom of the page, we have a security restriction field. And the default is always share intake globally. And in ROI terms, share intake globally is essentially the client saying, yes, I am fine with my information being shared. That's kind of like the HMIS terminology of written consent. So if the client signs on this line that yes, they are willing to share their information, or if you as staff have gotten verbal consent and have signed on this line, then you would leave the default as is at share intake globally. If the client indicates that they do not want their information shared, then you would make the physical change to restrict to organization. So if you are not able to get written consent here, if the client indicates that they do not want their information shared and so they do not sign here, alternatively, if the client verbally tells you, no, I do not want my information shared, then you will have to make this switch in HMIS, this restrict to organization. And that just means that only your organization will be able to find that client record, as opposed to share intake globally, which means the client record is available to all agencies on our system, and they're able to find and view things like their demographic and enrollment information. There is a third middle option here, and I get a lot of questions about this, share intake to MOU/info release. Because our system is so open, and we encourage sharing data as much as possible, share intake to MOU/info release is almost exactly the same as share intake globally. There really is not much difference between these two. The only agencies that technically do not share, I'm doing bunny quotes here, share our MOU in HMIS would be those agencies that serve specific populations like youth-only agencies, for example. But even then, youth-only agencies already know, it's in their HMIS training that they need to set this as restricted organization as their default. So for our intent and purpose, this share intake to MOU info release it is not relevant. The two that you should be interested in figuring out which one applies to your client would be the share intake globally or restrict to organization. So for this example, I'm going to say that my client did indicate that they are willing to share their information, so I'm going to leave this at the default, share intake globally, and select finish. That's going to take us to the family members page, and you'll see that my client does have a child. If we scroll all the way to the right, we'll see that there is a restriction status that we can change for family members. So if the client indicates that they are willing to share their children's information, and remember what that looks like on the paper ROI. So if they do not sign in this box, meaning they do want or they are comfortable with their children's information being shared, then you would leave in HMIS the default for that minor individual, share intake globally. That is also true if we go to verbal consent. Does the participant consent to share their children's information? If that is a yes, and then you get a project staff signature here, then again, that translates into share intake globally in HMIS. Restrict to organization, that would be if verbal consent, if this is a no, if this checkbox is a no, and you do not get that verbal consent granted, that is restrict to information in HMIS. Alternatively, I know I'm going back and forth here, guys, please bear with me. If they indicate in this minor children information box that they do not want to share their children's information, they fill out the children's name, and they sign here, participant signature. If you see a signature in this box, that is your cue to restrict to organization that particular record. All right, just one extra thing. So that's what it looks like in the workflow or during an intake, but you can also access those pages outside of the workflow. And that's especially important if the client decides that they want to change their sharing status. So if you go to Edit Client under Client Profile, you see the same basic client information page that we saw during the intake. We can scroll down, and we have that same security restriction. So the client might start off okay with sharing their information, but perhaps for whatever reason they want to revoke that sharing, that access. This is where you would go to change it outside of the workflow. You would select Finish. And the same is true for family members. If we click on the family members icon, we get that same family members page that we saw in the intake, and again, you would scroll all the way to the right, and you have this restriction status field at the right where you can make any changes necessary. One final thing that I want to talk about before I hand things off to Antonio, you may find yourself in, especially in situations where the client indicates that they want to change their sharing status, you may find yourself in a pickle if you were not the agency that originally created the client record. If that's the case, you may find that you do not have access to this restriction status. It may be grayed out, or you may not even see it. You will if you have that kind of situation, you will likely have to reach out to us to make that change, but we're probably going to follow up with you to follow up with the client. What I have seen personally is that a client may not realize that they have multiple records in HMIS, and one record may be set to share intake globally and another be set to restrict to organization, which might create problems. Or the client record that is set to share intake globally may have records, multiple records, enrollment information, service information, referrals, that are from different agencies, from multiple agencies. And if we restrict that record suddenly, then other agencies are no longer able to see information that they may have put on that client record. So that can be a little tricky. It does require us to kind of unravel the ball of yarn, so to speak. And in some instances, what has to be done is just creating a completely new client record just for that organization that is restricted. So that has happened in the past, and we try and move forward on a case-by-case basis when those sorts of things happen. So if you find yourself in that situation, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. All right, I am going to stop sharing and hand it off to Antonio, and I will be keeping an eye out on the chat box to see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Victoria. Let me pull up my slides. Okay, so I'll be covering HMIS ethics in this section. So ethical versus non-ethical or unethical uses of HMIS data. Client data should be used to inform decisions, not to deny service. So in this next example, I will cover ways that you should and should not use client data. So an example of using data ethically would be to use a client's record to match them to relevant services. So if you see that they have a barrier and you know of an organization that helps with that, or maybe your own organization has a service for it, that would be an ethical use of data, would be matching that data or matching the client's record to his needs. On the other side of the coin, using that data unethically would be to deny them service for race, ethnicity, or gender identity. An example of using data ethically, another one, is referring clients to organizations within the homeless response system. So within HMIS, hopefully all of you are familiar with the referral system. So using that referral system within HMIS, that would be an ethical use of data. On the flip side, an unethical use of data would be providing client information to third parties, right? So hopefully no one's doing that. My last example here of using data ethically is checking in on the client. So, if capacity permits, it's always nice to check in on the client if maybe you see they're going through a tough time. The other side of this is using data from a client record to harass the client. So maybe calling them by their dead name or something like that. So the last example that I have here for using data unethically, which isn't as obvious as these other examples, and it's entering clients into HMIS under another user's login. So whenever you enter in information under someone else's login, all of that data is being tagged as being created by another user, right? So that right there would be unethical because you're entering in data on behalf of someone else's login, or on behalf of some other person without them knowing, or maybe even with them knowing. If you see, any unethical behavior regarding HMIS, go ahead and send an email describing the situation to hmis@thn.org, and we'll try our best to take care of the situation the best we can. So we're going to end on a little Q&A session, so we'll stay on the call. If any of you have any questions, feel free to send them in the chat now. And if it's for a specific person, feel free to call out the name, and we'll try to respond to it over the mic here.
Yeah, so as Antonio said, we're going to stick around for a few more minutes and answer any questions. It looks like some people are typing, so we will stick around for another 5 or 10 minutes as long as those questions are coming in and do our best to answer those. But for everyone else, thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully we will see you all soon. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Happy to have y'all. Hope you have a good afternoon.